Hello everybody and welcome to this video on the genre of the sign of 4. Everything you see in this video comes from Mr. Bruff's guide to the sign of 4, which you can pick up through following the links in the description. So in today's video we're going to talk about genre, and just as with the gothic, romance or science fiction genres, detective fiction has its own conventions and devices which appear regularly throughout the novels it produces. The Sherlock Holmes novels were some of the earliest detective stories, and they certainly helped to shape many of the literary structures we would identify as belonging to the detective fiction genre. This man is Edgar Allan Poe, writing in the 19th century, and is widely credited as being the first proponent of detective fiction in the West. While detective stories historically have existed in other cultures, such as in China and the Arab world, the detective genre as we know it today stems from the early 19th century, and Edgar Allan Poe, while being influenced specifically by a short story by E.T.A. Hoffmann written in 1819, wrote The Murders in the Rue Morgue, which was first published in a magazine in 1841. This story presents for the first time many of the devices we would recognise in Arthur Conan Doyle's stories, specifically the close friend as narrator, as in Watson, and the devilishly crafted barriers to detection. In The Murders in the Rue Morgue, a mother and daughter have been murdered in a fourth-floor room of a building on the Rue Morgue, which is a fictional street in Paris. The door was locked from the inside, the mother's throat was slashed, and the daughter was strangled and stuffed in the chimney. You might recognise this as a romantic comedy starring Adam Sandler. No, I'm joking. The case baffles the police, and Dupin, the story's amateur detective, offers his assistance, and he ultimately unravels the story and solves the mystery, much to the embarrassment of the local police. And we learnt in the last video about the contemporary attitudes towards the Metropolitan Police in Arthur Conan Doyle's lifetime. In the Sherlock Holmes story, there's a constant tension between Holmes, who engages in reason, science and logic, and the police, who are depicted as bumbling, brutish and clumsy. You can see this picture here on the screen. This is, of course, the modern film version with Robert Downey Jr., which sticks to the same premise. The police are always one step behind. You know, Holmes is the sort of genius of detection, and this gives Holmes an air of superiority over the police, who, although they're being put out by his obvious superiority, are usually glad of his help by the end of the story. Holmes also displays his astonishing abilities in the field of deduction and reasoning, which are key detective genre characteristics. So some of the most basic conventions of the genre of detective fiction I'm going to go through now, and then there are some which are more specific to Sherlock Holmes himself. So number one, the detective must be intriguing for the reader. You know, detective fiction even today is very popular. There are lots of new detective books coming out at the moment. It's one of the genres that people have enjoyed reading for a couple of 100 years. And yet the reason people enjoy reading them mostly is not because of the crimes, but because of the detective. So you might have, you know, like my granddad, for example, he reads non-stop detective fiction. I've read a bit myself, you know, a bit of Inspector Rebus, a bit of Joe Nesbo. Personally, I'm not that into detective fiction because I like stories, the actual plot to be interesting, and the way it's written. You know, I quite like that sort of thing, whereas detective fiction I find a bit predictable. But of course, as we see here in genre, convention number one, it is the detective who is intriguing. So it's important that the detective appears an outsider to those involved with the case, often presented through strange quirks or mannerisms the detective displays. And of course, Holmes in many of the stories displays strange habits. We see that in the films as well as in the books. He rushes off unannounced, he disappears, asks strange questions, and of course his party trick of being able to deduce the most remarkable facts about a person simply by looking at them. Add to this his abhorrence for the dull routine of existence, his predilection for heroin and cocaine, and you have a consulting detective which, according to Holmes, is a profession he created, for I am the only one in the world. So all the time when you're looking at famous detective fiction, and it's the same with film and TV, you know, like Columbo, All of detective fiction, the detective has to be intriguing. The second convention of the genre that's really important is the crime must be worthy of investigation. It must be important enough to attract the attention of an important detective. So the majority of cases involve either murder or theft or of incredibly valuable items. And it's also significant in terms of background. A case that's simple to solve is of no interest to the detective, and Holmes himself admits in The Sign of Four he craves for mental exaltation. He rubs his hands together and his eyes glisten in The Sign of Four when he hears the outline of the case. Convention number 3, the facts must be presented to the reader at the same time as the detective. This is all about the interesting position the reader is in detective fiction. It's one of the reasons I'm not a fan of detective fiction, because we as the reader are presented with clues at the same time as the detective, and the problem with that is we can work out what's going on. Of course, sometimes you get detective fiction, particularly modern detective fiction, where it's just a random, unannounced thing that happens, and you think, well, that's not fair. All of the clues were there to put you off. But in terms of the traditional detective fiction, you've got to keep the reader engaged, and the detective story must present the facts of the case to the reader at the same time as to the detective. That gives the reader a chance to interpret the clues and solve the case before the detective can. And there's almost a sense of competition between the reader and the detective as to who can solve it first. But of course, in the case of Sherlock Holmes, it only serves to underline his amazing abilities even further as he utilises his powers of deduction and logic to solve what to us might seem an impenetrable puzzle. The fourth convention, all the loose ends must be tied up by the end of the story. All good detective stories wrap up all the different plot strands by the end, but most importantly, always in a logical and understandable way. The end of the story is the opportunity for the detective to explain to the reader, and usually Watson and the police in the case of the Sherlock Holmes novels, just how he solved the case and put all the clues together. The ending should make sense to the reader and further impress on him or her the skills of the detective in unlocking the mystery. So while these are some of the most well-known conventions, there are some specifics which we see in Sherlock Holmes and which we see in The Sign of the Four. And these conventions often reflect the concerns, beliefs and tastes of the original intended audience for the Sherlock Holmes story, middle-class Victorians. So these generic conventions tie into the historical context. So the exotic is one of those conventions. Many of the Holmes stories, and indeed much Victorian literature in general, concerned itself with things from faraway lands. There was a fascination, a mixture of interest and fear in Victorian society with exotic or foreign people and things. In The Sign of Four, we have Tonga, a small man from the Andaman Islands, as feared as a vicious native and is described repeatedly by the man he's most loyal to, Jonathan Smalls, as being a hellhound. There's also the retelling of the story of the Agra treasure, where we're introduced to the world of the Raj, India, in the run-up to the mutiny. The reader sees at first hand the far reaches of the British Empire, which would have been fascinating for the Victorian reader, while also comforting because they would be able to experience it without the dangers which are attached. Another one is money or inheritance or class. Victorian society placed a great emphasis on money, wealth and people's inheritance. It imbued someone with a level of status that would give them access to a different type of person and place. In The Sign of Four, this element of the Victorian period is reflected in the fact that murders which occur are prompted by a desire for money, treasure and wealth. In fact, nearly everything which occurs in the story is prompted by this desire for valuables. The Agra treasure is at the centre of all the action. It's what drives men to murder other men, honourable men to fall from grace, families to fall apart, and someone to write a letter to Miss Morstan stating she's a wronged woman. The fascination with the treasure is the central idea in the story, which Holmes arrives at the end thanks to his great skill. Class, too, is a hot topic in Victorian society, and we see this in particular when Holmes goes to visit Mordecai Smith, the boat owner, and his wife. While the husband is away, Holmes attempts to get some information from his wife, and afterwards tells Watson that the way to deal with people of that sort, by which we can infer he means lower or working class, is never let them think that the information can be of the slightest importance to you. There's clearly a class divide in Victorian society, which is reflected by how Holmes deals with particular people. He also acknowledges the upper-class gentleman is restricted in where in the city he can move freely, and as such often wears disguises or employs the Baker Street irregular. Number 3 then, Holmes as hero or Gothic or fear in a safe place. Sherlock Holmes throughout Conan Doyle's novels is portrayed as the definitive hero of the piece. Particularly in The Sign of 4, he's rescuing a vulnerable woman, Miss Morstan, who's in need of assistance, and this theme constantly reinforces the Victorian idea of the female being the weaker of the species. This would have been comforting for Victorian readers to see the male figures, Holmes, using his guile and intelligence to come to the rescue of Miss Morstan. Allied to this was the relatively new desire that Victorians had to experience fear, but in a safe way, Gothic literature. The reader in The Sign of 4 is taken to the far reaches of the British Empire, meeting savages and natives, thieves and murderers, and even realises they're not safe in their own city of London. There's repeated reference to London being shrouded in mist, unsafe, full of unsavoury people and dark alleyways. As Holmes himself admits when he says the Baker Street irregulars can go everywhere, see everything, overhear everyone, the upper classes were restricted in what parts of the city they could safely visit. The Sherlock Holmes stories then allow a sort of escapism for the audience to feel. The audience can feel fear without the inherent danger, in much the same way as we watch horror films to feel fear without actually being chased by a knife-wielding maniac. So that's genre. If you found this video useful, please do pick up the ebook and the links are in the description. Mr. Bruff's Guide to Arthur Conan Doyle's The Sign of 4 is an absolute must-have title for anybody studying this text. For just £3.99 you can get my guide, which contains the complete Sherlock Holmes story, as well as detailed analysis, 50 pages nearly of analysis. That's chapter summaries, the author, setting, context, genre, character analysis of Sherlock Holmes, Watson, Miss Mary Morstan, analysis of language, analysis of structure, and a sample question and answer, exactly the kind of thing you need for your GCSE studies, as well as the complete original text. Just £3.99 at mrbruff.com. Please do pick up a copy.